All right, it's time to talk about forms in Rails. You've already gone through the homework. You've seen forms in Rails several times now, both homework 6 and 8 delved into it. So a lot of this is going to be review for you, sort of in a lecture form. Again, this is section 4.6 in the book. That sort of gives you a real condensed view of forms in Rails. Again, the materials I've linked to in the homework give you much longer and I think more explanatory explanations about what's going on with forms. And so you probably want to check those out. And of course, there's a whole raft of gigantic amount of documentation for a web framework such as Rails that you inevitably end up reading a good chunk of it to figure everything out. I know it can be absolutely overwhelming. It was a bit overwhelming for myself the first time. What I've tried to do in the course is sort of guide you in this path so that you don't feel like you have to read everything, so that we can actually get things done with it in a sort of focused manner. But anyway, let's talk about these forms in Rails. One of the big ideas here is that we're going to call methods in our views. So these are the views that we're creating in herb, the template language. And we're going to call these methods for Rails to generate the correct HTML for our form. Okay, so we're making, again, we've talked about HTML forms, and this is sort of as mentioned, it's a little frustrating. So we ultimately produce HTML that goes back to the user, and then the browser interprets that and shows the nice web page to the user. But we don't write the HTML form. We might do some other HTML, as you've seen in the views. You do an H1 for a header, and you got paragraph tags and div tags and some things like that. But when it comes to the form itself, we're not going to write any of that HTML. What we're going to be doing is we're going to use methods in Rails to generate the HTML. So you end up having to really kind of know two things. You need to know how that HTML works. And you also have to know how Rails methods work. It's not one of those things in my mind where you get to be like, yeah, I learned Rails forms making and I never had to know anything about HTML forms. It's ultimately of utility, of use to you to understand what these commands in Rails are generating, because you're going to often want to go view the generated HTML to see what's happening. And if you can't read it, that can be a bit frustrating. And likewise, like, this stuff's not the easiest thing. And so when it doesn't work, you're like, what in the world? So I did this command in Rails. What did it actually produce? So you go view the source and you go, oh, well, no wonder it's not working for me. Like, that HTML is not really the HTML that I needed. And you go back and forth between how to make the command do what you want the HTML to do. And now some of you are going to be like, why don't we just write it in HTML? And the really big reason is that Rails, when we utilize the method in Rails, it's going to add in particular special token tags, which are security features to prevent things like cross-site scripting attacks and things like that. So there are important security considerations when building web apps. And Rails, as an industrial quality web framework, has these mechanisms in place to protect us as developers from deploying apps that are inherently insecure. If we don't use the Rails system, we won't get those protections, and we will be ultimately putting our users and ourselves from a liability standpoint at risk. So we want to use these mechanisms, and we've got to get them to work. All right. So what else can we say about Rails forms other than all of that? Well, one of the neat things is that they are designed to work with models. So they're very intelligent to know how to deal with models. So we have a model and we're going to put it in the form. And the idea is we're going to collect information for that model from the form. It's definitely built up and designed to handle that. But just so you know, absolutely, but can also work without a model. Okay. And, you know, we can specify the URL and method. So this is whether or not it's a get, a post, etc., explicitly. So you can basically, you can be like, yeah, I'm going to use this model and I'm going to get all this default functionality. But you can peel back sort of the layers and specify more and more options to the methods in Rails to craft it to do exactly what you want. You don't have to utilize the automatic stuff. But as always, most of the time, when you can work within the framework and have it do the work for you, let it do the work for you. Make your life easy, okay? So I've already mentioned that when our forms don't work for us, we're going to want to be able to dig in and look at the HTML. So keep that in mind. All right. So I think this is important that before you make a form, you want to be thinking about or thinking of your routes and controller action. Okay. So what do I mean by this? So, all right, remember that we have methods that we can choose from. We can have a post, we can have a patch, we can have a delete. These are our key methods to use with a form. You can also utilize a get. When would we use a get with a form? We would use a get with a form. This is for notes for the project. Often in a situation where we want to apply a filter, okay? Something where the idea is we're going to generate a new query to an existing page. So we want to actually make a request, a get request to a page. We want to put things in the query string of the URL, because that's what a get with a form will do. And we want it to be a get. So we want to actually be requesting and reading data, but we want that request and reading of the data from the database to be filtered in some way or changed in some way as per the specifications we've put into the query string. Well, how do we generate what's in the query string? We generate it with a form where we've specified a get request. And that's where that comes into play. Otherwise, you're not going to ever really see yourself putting get requests with a form. You're going to be, the vast majority are posts. This is when we're going to create objects, add something to the database. Patch is when we're going to be editing things, changing something that's existing, and deleting, of course, is when we're going to be removing a resource from a database. All right. So we also, you should be thinking of absolutely the input that the form is going to be generating. And how do you know that? Well, again, what you're going to do is you're going to be thinking about your routes in this controller action, okay? That's all tied together. And you're like, remember, it's like a method into the program. And you're like, yeah, I understand that my controller action is this method, and I want to run this method, and I want to, for example, I want to edit this object. So I know it's going to be a patch call with HTTP, and what am I going to send in for my input? Oh, I'm going to have values for this model, this object that I'm trying to edit. So those are the things that are going to come in. I know what they're going to be, and you could actually, I actually personally like to write the controller first, because absolutely, I'm going to be thinking, well, this is my route, this is my method, I've got it tied to this controller action. I expect to receive the following things in from my form. I expect them to be named the following things. I'm going to go through and do my parameter whitelisting and what are the approved parts. All right, and I will write up the whole controller. And in 342, we'll show you that you can actually then write tests against your controller, and you don't even have to have the view. You know, you could render the view, but you don't even need to render the view. It could be a default blank view. Then what I do is then I go in and then I start working on the view to be like, I've already basically created a specification about what it is that I need. I had this route and I had this controller action. I wrote the controller. I said I needed this input to do my job. Then I'm in here when I'm trying to make the form, I'm trying to come up with, okay, yeah, the form's got to send that data in when it's posted, okay, or patched or deleted or whatever. Now I know what I need to make that form do because I specified it already when I wrote the controller. So what I'm trying to say here is what we really want to do is you want to be thinking of both the method and what input will come from or come in the form of the params of the posted, so posted form, okay? One thing to note is that, you might be thinking about, you might have input also via a query string. Okay, so you're going to have stuff, the form is going to send inputs in, you might have inputs, they all come in on the params. So the params gives us these name value pairs. You've already thought about what they need to be. You've written your controller. Now get the form on the view to generate that stuff for you. And sure, new to this, you might have come up with the wrong idea, and you're probably going to go back and forth between the controller and view until you get it all worked out and working correctly. Again, so this idea that I keep going back to is that you are trying to call your web API, which again is basically talking about what is your route, because the route is the HTTP verb and a path, okay? And you might have some parameters in that path, and you'll also know that you're going to have the notion of passing in data via the post. That's all sort of how to call your web API. All right, but you're going to be trying to do this via the form. That's the thing, is you're setting up the form to be like, when the user does this, the user will be making a request to my web app of this nature, okay? And to have it so you're going to do this via the form. And the idea is then you have it run code with the submitted parameters. All right. Great. So, sorry I didn't leave that on the board very long. I guess you have to pause the video. All right. Anyways, so what is the real conclusion to that whole thing I was trying to say? I'll just write it on the board. Is really thus, I really think you should write the controller first. But again, might be a chicken versus egg type thing. You might find it easier to write your form and see what the parameters are that are coming in from it, and then write your controller. Okay? Absolutely. How would you see what the parameters are coming in from the view, from the form, when you as a user interface, you click it? Absolutely easy. You know that the form request is going to be going via the routes, and it's going to call a controller action. So you go into your controller action and you write by bug. Okay? So again, reminder, this is your biggest friend in the world, by bug. You just write by bug in there. And then so you launch your server, you go to your website, you've got that form, you fill it out and you hit the submit button. And then you go back into Codio and you'll see that it's gone and it's dropped in where you wrote by bug, it's stopped and it's in the debugger. And all you need to do then is you can just type params, because params is available as a variable, and the debugger will show you what params is. And you can go, well, those are the parameters I'm sending in. And you can even see the data that you typed in, and you can go, now I know how I want to write my controller. So that is, you might find that easier. Personally, I find doing the controller and specifying what I expect and then making sure that the form does it works that way works for me. You might find the opposite is a million times easier. I understand that. So there's no thing that you must do it that way. So I do think, try doing the controller as what you expect, and then get the view to do it. But you might find view easier. Either way, remember, you can write by bug anywhere in your app. And this creates a breakpoint. And you can use the debugger. To see what's going on. I could not have existed and gotten through learning Rails without this functionality. So, by bug, and you can put it anywhere. You can put it in a view. Now it's Ruby code, so it's got to be in the special. If it's in a view, you're going to have to, have it exist in the special, tags, or you could put it anywhere you want. but it will. It'll stop in a view, and then you can inspect the parameters and things and the values that you have in the view, because the view is just running code. So it's a super powerful mechanism. You can stick it in your models, you can stick it in your controllers, stick it in your views. You can stick it in the seeds. So again, when you do you run your seeds to load your seed data into your database, that's just Ruby code. You can stick a bybug in there, and you can step through and you can debug adding seeds to your database. Absolutely. All right. Okay. So yeah, I do think kind of when we go about the process, for me personally, always start with the routes, then I do controller, then view. But again, this might be a back and forth process, and it almost guaranteed will be. And you might start with the view and then go to the controller. But that's my normal setup and thinking about things. All right, so let's look at this in a little bit more detail now. One thing to keep in mind is good old RTFM, read the fine manual. All right, so this is a saying that people used to have on an old thing called Usenet. It still exists, though I don't know who uses it for any legitimate purpose anymore. Nowadays, people use Reddit, and Reddit's not as good as Usenet was, but then again, I'm just an old fogey. Anyway, so people would post like, they'd ask questions about software and something, and people, it's obvious that the person hadn't bothered to like read the manual. And so they would just, basically their answer would be to RTFM, read the fine manual. All right. So, and yeah, maybe F didn't mean fine, but anyway, read the fine manual. And so what am I meaning about this? The reality is you know, I want to point out that a lot of software development is kind of like being a lawyer. And you got to read the fine print. Lawyers do a ton of reading, and it's very exact sort of reading. It's like really like, what do these words really mean? You're gonna do a ton of this in software. These are big systems, they've been documented, and there's a lot to read to know how to like flip the right switches, so to speak, and get it to work. So read it's kind of the same thing. It's like read the instructions. You know, don't just dive in there. You're gonna have to acknowledge that you're gonna spend a lot of time reading things. So in particular, you know, I've linked to these things in the homework, but you've got these guides that have been written by people to help you understand things, besides the books, of course. But there is a thing called the form helpers. These are largely, this is all about what does it take to actually use the forms, okay? And then inside of this, there is a link. You can click on, so they'll mention form with, and it's actually a link. Click on form with for the detailed docs. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that these guides are helpful guides to tell you kind of about how to use them. It's like a tutorial, but it's not the documentation. The documentation is when you click and you get into the, oh my goodness gracious, like every single little method and all of its options and all of its parameters and all of the here's and there's. That's what you end up doing. So this leads us in to the notion that, yeah, we're going to talk about form with, okay? All right, so form with is the method that we use to produce a form. All right, so it's a method call. You're going to call this method, and it's a method that exists within action view. So when you're writing a view, you're actually like running code inside of sort of a larger class space, so to speak, and certain methods have been on that class have been made available to you, and one of them is the form with method, and it takes it has a whole bunch of possible arguments, but these are the key ones for us. Arguments, you could provide it a model, okay, and so this is a model that's been set up with resource routes. So you really wouldn't set it up with a model that didn't have all the proper resource routes. So the idea is, yeah, I have a route for creating it and a route for, for patching it and so forth, but set up in the Rails RESTful manner. So they have to match, and it's basically, you've got a model where, yes, you said this model and you used resources in the routes, or you completely copied what would be the exact type of routes that resources for that model would have generated. Rails is going to rely upon it. So if you supply model, it should be something like this. If it's not like that, don't be using the model argument. So you're basically either going to do a model, or your big thing is you're going to then supply a specific URL. Because with the model, you don't need to specify the URL because it knows where all the special resource routes are, and it knows where it should be submitting itself based upon the nature of the model. It's really quite fancy and confusing all at once. So again, the URL is where to submit the form. This is in an HTML form. It's called the action. And then you have a method. All right, and these are strings such as get, post, patch, and delete. And then we are also, on both of these, we're always going to do local. So then we're always going to include local as a variable, and we're going to set to true. And this is means do not use JavaScript. All right, we've got JavaScript turned off on our apps. It's an added layer of complexity. You don't need to worry about it. You are not to use JavaScript in your apps at all, anywhere. So we're JavaScript free in MSCI 245 and 342. And so be sure you've got local set to true. All right. There are lots of other options. As I said, see the documents for them. So let's take a real quick example here. All right. So let's say we had a simple model, songs, and it's got in it an ID and a title. Very simple. So we're just going to have a collection of songs, and we've listed them with their title. So we can easily make ourselves a form with a model. We call form with. We pass in, we say it's got a model. We will have set up in the controller action a instance variable at song. And in that instance variable, we will have put a song model object. Okay. And that's our call. Now, by the way, using these parentheses are optional, as you've seen in Ruby. You might find it helpful. It helps you sometimes to remember, yeah, I'm making a method call, and I got to pass the parameters in. Now this method call it does the really fancy stuff with the ability to do blocks, okay? And so what it does is it goes, and this actually ends up, it sets into here for us what's known as a form builder object, okay? And then we're going to use our form builder in here. Okay, so I'm not going to write the code right now, but in here we call form dot, and we'll have something like this. And we're going to use this to create all of our labels, our inputs, and the submit button. So there's all sorts of things on the form builder class that are used to generate the form. So this is, it goes through here. It's going to put this form builder in here. Then it's going to take our calls off of this object here. And through all of that, it's going to generate a whole bunch of HTML that gets returned and then is spit out as part of the view. Note that this end here does not have the equal sign. So end does not return a value. Don't be putting an equal sign in there. A lot of you might make that mistake and you're like, will not understand the error message. So keep in mind, we always have to know which code are we using that returns a value that we need to have spit out in the view, and what is just Ruby code that's part of the syntax and everything. So end doesn't get one, but form with does. All right. So, let's go ahead and modify this, and I'll actually show you an example of something in here. All right, so we could actually generate some elements to a form. So I'll call form TextField. All right. So again, I'll just put the end tag here so that we feel good about this. This is not a complete form. It doesn't have a submit button. All right. But actually I'll get rid of the end. So let's just show you that this is the way that we call it. And this will generate, if you go back to your HTML and forms, it's going to generate for me a text field. All right. So this is a method of form builder. All right. And form builder takes an argument. So this is an argument of calling text field. And the argument is what's called the method. Okay. So it's the first parameter. The first parameter is the method. And it's like, well, what do you mean by method? What they mean by this is that on this model object, they expect that if you supply title here, that song.title is a method that exists. And what they can then do is they'll know not only that they should set up this whole text field with regard to produce a parameter when submitted called title, but it will also be able to go, so if this model comes in and it already has values set, so like a user is going to try to edit a model, and so we have fetched that model from the database, and we want to be able to show it to the user for them to edit, this object will already have data in it. So what they can do is they can call on the object in here, they can call the title method on it to obtain what the existing title is of that song and put it in the text field, and so the user can edit the existing title. That's a lot of stuff going on here, but that's the way it's working. Okay. All right. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say about there. I might go into it in more detail in a future lecture, but these are really the key ideas. A lot of it is based around where you're going to do everything in the final project with, for the most part, with models. Sometimes, yes, you might just set up something with a URL and a method. That's entirely possible. And again, that's just your desire. You're going to set up a form that you're like, I need this to happen, and I want it to be sent to the controller to run. So that's also a possibility. But a lot of it will be done with these models. And again, they're designed nicely to let you handle when you're both going to be able to use the same form for both creating a new object and as well as editing it. And I'll show you this with regard to what's known as a partial in some future lectures. This is sort of more details. It's not necessary to know about partials to get things to work. I think Homework 8 had one in it. I can't remember. So you might have already been exposed to that. And because if you do scaffolding in Rails, Rails will make use of partials because, again, the form that we generate, the code that we write for editing a model in a view is exactly the same code that we write for creating a new object of that model. And so we have basically a way to include that code into multiple views, and that's called partials. And we make those calls to render. You'll see that in the you should see that in Homework 8 in the way it's set up with that, but you'll certainly see it if you decide to do scaffolding. All right, so that wraps up the key stuff about talking about forms in Rails.